gonna set a timer here for 3 minutes. We're gonna do this in parts, 3-minute intervals. Bismillah. 1, 2, 3. Hey, how's it going, everyone? This is Talal from MentorAgile.com. And funny enough, my second day recap of the CSPO, I was filming it on another device. And unfortunately, I don't know what happened to it, but the phone just won't turn on. There wasn't any damage, no fall, no water damage or anything like that. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna refilm my second recap of day 2 and just go over what we did and actually share. So I'm gonna split this up into a few parts so this can be used more than just, for, excuse me, for just one video. I wanna break this down into parts so that way, you can at least get some context. So when you do have time to watch the full video, which I would encourage you do, you can take full benefit. Regardless of you not watching these videos, I will have, like I mentioned before, a free PDF that I'm gonna have available for the full 4 days of my training, and in terms of all the notes and all the items that I took away from it. And I've been taking quite extensive notes. I showed it to the instructor yesterday. He was actually like, wow, okay. Even though there are the slides that we went over, they're going to be available for download. I just still I realized I was 30 seconds late to, or 1 minute late to day 3, which starts at 2:30. It was 2:31. I was like, oh shoot. So I had to cut the recap short for day 2, but essentially we picked up right where we left off. We went over the homework, which was to go over the validation, exercise that we covered in day 2. And essentially, we started off with a check-in to see how everybody's doing, and we get into the philosophy of why you should do check-ins. Check-ins are not the same thing as the daily scrum, and you should typically avoid doing a check-in during the daily scrum. But essentially, there's a nice point that the instructor mentions. It's that everybody has baggage constantly, 24/7, for whatever reason, right? And it's not necessarily like correct to think that your team will always be baggage free, right? So you want to have that assumption that people have lives, they have things going on. So the check-in helps create like a psychologically safe environment for the team, so you can have that open, honest respect and actually engage the team towards being productive, right? And it can help like you as a product owner or anyone as a team member to help identify any potential issues that could be happening in a team member's life, and you can help them by get them in contact with the right resources and departments that can maybe help them out, right? Then we got into, like I said, I was going over the check-in. We finished the validation exercise. Then we started getting into Scrummery, which is Scrum theory, and the way we did that informally is we basically came up with similes using household or kitchen items and using that and comparing it to a Scrum term. So our examples were a freezer is like a product backlog because you can store items in for a long time. And I promise it's not me, it's just that is the one that I made, and that's the one that was the team's favorite. They liked it. It was funny because ideally you don't want to have items in a backlog for that long, but practically speaking, items can get frozen over a period of time. Let's just put it that way, right? So I'm going to finish up. I'm going to go ahead and take my break. I'll be right back and we'll get into the second hour. Stay tuned. Buddy, day 3 started. I was a minute late because I was filming, again, refilming day 2's recap. We did a quick check-in. The purpose of the check-in is to help align the team, understand where they're coming from when it comes to their mindset. Because one point that the teacher mentioned is that everybody has baggage at all times. So the whole point of the check-in is that you want to create an environment where people can leave everything that's going on in them, leave it outside, and create a space to collaborate, right? And I think that's awesome. It's a very practical exercise. It was really awesome to see how people participated in that. Then we figured out what we're going to do. We updated the burn down chart. We're making good progress. And we made the commitments for today. Then we got right into it, where we basically got into the homework, which is to review the validation exercise. Then we did an exercise with the group where we basically came up with discussion points as to why validation and discovery exercises are important and how it contributes to successful outcomes. The idea is that it helps get a clear picture of the product earlier on by producing those low fidelity concepts and getting, being more proactive with the customer, making them feel like they're important, and it results in a better product development experience overall. Then we got into Scrummery, and then after break, we're going to get into it formally with a lecture. That's what the instructor said. But basically, we came up with similes and compared them to Scrum terms. So we had to do 5 of them using household items and comparing them to Scrum terms. So out of the 5, the favorite one was, ironically, the one that I said first, which is that a freezer is like a product backlog because you can store items in it for a long time. Even though you're not supposed to do that, with a backlog, you want to keep things moving. In real life scenarios, it's very possible where things can get stuck in there for a while. So I'm going to go ahead. I'll check in back with you afterwards. Until then, stay tuned. So I don't know why we took a break early. We just did take a break about 20-30 minutes ago. But basically, we did before the first hour. In the first hour, we did like the informal understanding of Scrum theory. And then basically during this hour, it was like a 20-minute formal lecture on Scrum theory. And the idea of the lecture is that the notes that I took is that the sprint is the time box period of time the team commits to producing an increment, which again, the increment is what I've also learned before to be like the PSP or the MVP, the potentially shippable product or the minimal viable product. It's usable at the end of the sprint, right? And essentially, this is where we have the sprint planning. And a key thing to understand is the developers actually own the sprint backlog, the product owner doesn't. Because in times where, let's say in the middle of a sprint, there is some type of change request that comes along, the developers, since they're the ones that committed to the time, they should rightfully so have the authority to negotiate what trade-offs are willing, compromises are, are the stakeholders or the customer willing to make an adjustment during a sprint, which is fair. And I'm glad that we got to cover that, so it helps cement that even more. And essentially, we went over the Scrum team. Formally, the Scrum team is consisted up to max 10 people. Up to 10 people, that's what the instructor said. It consists of the product owner, the developer, and then based on up to 10, it could include, up to 8 developers, which could also be like, let's say 6 developers and 2 QAs, but essentially 8 technical units within the team to make up to 10, right? Then sorry, the flash is getting in my eyes, so I'm trying to adapt here. The whole idea here is inspect and adapt, right? So the events that do take place in Scrum, such as the daily Scrum, the sprint review, and the sprint retro, these are opportunities for the team to regularly inspect and adapt, especially during the daily Scrum. It helps keep the developers on track and address any of the impediments and blockers. And for us, that's exactly what we use. And I have ever used a daily Scrum before. So it's good that that point was reiterated. And sprint review, this is an opportunity where stakeholders can give you, they can inspect and they can give you feedback. Based on that, the team can then internally inspect and adapt accordingly. And the retrospective is a healthy activity for the team to truly internally reflect on what are we doing right, what are we not doing so well, and how can we improve. And essentially, then we covered the product backlog. That is the single source of truth that the developers and the Scrum team will use to pull items to essentially, produce their sprint planning, and actually commit to items that result in valuable increments, right? And then after the break, we're gonna do like a refinement exercise where we do a sprint refinement or product backlog refinement, which for us in my last project, I was doing twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It was a 1-hour meeting. Because we're a Kanban team, we were regularly producing, I was regularly producing stories, and they constantly needed to be refined and prioritized because of the fact that some were ad hoc requests, some were, later down the line requests, but they constantly kept coming from the business. And then we went over the 5 principles of Scrum to remember, which is openness, respect, courage, focus, commitment. And basically the next exercise when we come back is the consequences of adopting Scrum partially, or the way that he ended it off was saying that Agilists, practitioners of Agile, they'll say that that's called Scrum but. Like, I'm doing Scrum, but I'm doing this differently. And there's a quote that the instructor said, that Scrum only happens in its entirety. And it's in my notes. It's going to be part of the ebook. I'm going to take my break. See you all then. But essentially, we had a formal lecture about the product backlog. And essentially, the product backlog it lays out the overall product goal. It's a single source of truth for the team to refer and pull items from, and contains anything needed in the product, such as features, bugs/defects, and tech debt. And tech debt is something that occurs when you take shortcuts. So for our team, we would oftentimes do ad hocs that eventually would then have to be modified and adjusted into a proper release. So that's an example. User stories, that's telling the story from the customer's point of view and thinking customer centric. And from the user stories, that's when stories are derived. So there's that context that you can link back to at all times. And that's what you put in the product backlog. And then container of all ideas related to the product. Sorry, the flash again. Backlogs are linear but multifaceted, which means that they include priority and order. Priority determines urgency. Order determines the sequence that we will follow as a team. And it also has the size of the stories, which means how much effort is it going to take. The instructor's guideline is that a sprint shouldn't take more than a quarter a story shouldn't take more of a quarter of a sprint to complete. And then we have the attributes of the backlog, which is one, the description. It contains the outcomes over, so the description of the product, essentially that's what the individual items are containing in the backlog. We have the outcomes over deliverables. We have the acceptance criteria. And the definition of done is different than acceptance criteria, so I did misspeak earlier. So the thing is that a user story contains the acceptance criteria, but the reason why it's distinct from definition of done is three main reasons. Definition of done applies to a whole increment. Number two is an increment can be made based off one or more product backlog items. Number three, a team can deliver more than one increment during a sprint. So the acceptance criteria is specific to the story. The definition of done is based on the whole increment or the increments that are being provided at the end of the sprint. Then we go over DOVE, D-O-V-E. These are the attributes of the product backlog. The first one I just covered is description. Next is the order. Again, the PO maintains the responsibility to keep order of the backlog. Then we have the estimate and size. That's what we do during refinement. And then V is for value. This was apparently in the original Scrum Guide. Not the original Scrum Guide, sorry, the 2017 version of the Scrum Guide, but it was removed. So that's what DOVE is. And yeah, we're about to do a refinement session when we come back. I have a few minutes left on break. I'll check in with you. All right, so we just got done with day 3, and we did a few different activities, and I'm just going to quickly recap those. And again, like I said, I'm going to be posting my notes for free. So for all the 4 days, all the detailed notes that I took. But essentially, we did a refinement session, and we got guidelines of how often refinement should take place. So the instructor laid it out that refinement should take up 10% of the team's time, so about 4 hours a week. So oftentimes companies, organizations are not doing refinement enough, which can get in the way of producing outcomes rather than outputs, right? Then we already covered the value here. We did an exercise called Prune the Product Tree, where there was a visual of a tree. We have the base, we have the trunk, we have the leaves, and then we have all the way on top. And it was segmented now, next, later. So for our online murder mystery game, what were some features that we needed right away? What are some features that we could go next and then later? So some examples of now would be like, the online profile, gaming environment, and basic gaming features that are needed to at least get started. Next, we would have like online parties, so you can, play with your friends locally, and, like similar to PlayStation Plus, where you can play Call of Duty with your friends in a party. We would have that next. And then later, an example that we had was like VR support, and then also like AI bots. And then another feature was like make your own game, like in Minecraft, Roblox, like they'll make your own server, you can make your own environment. So that's like a later, So a very interesting point was if you invert the tree, you'll have a prioritized backlog, because you'll know what's most important and what's least important in terms of priority and order, which is nice. Then we played 2020 again, which is basically ranking like 10 items from least important to more important. It's a visual exercise. So we played that again, and basically we had to do that with like regulatory requirements, support calls, production defects, market research, product roadmap, sprint review, user story map, conversation with executives, analytics, and then last that we put as the least was tech specs, because how the product is made is something that should be negotiable, right? Epics are typically considered to be too big for a sprint. Stories are able to be fit into a sprint. The team owns the epics, the features, and tasks collectively. And the thing is that features, this can be calibrated per organization, because some organizations can refer to as a feature as something that can be fit into a sprint. Some will perceive it as it's too big for a sprint. then you break it onto stories. And a nice practical tip is that as a PO, you want to think 3 sprints ahead. And that's actually pretty practical when you put it that way. And I would agree with this. And then lastly, we did a retro.